see what we come up with. This will be a learning experience.
Yeah.
Cool. So today I am talking with Chris Diehl, and I'm just going to read it straight from his website. Chris is curious about the complexities of our world and our limited ability to comprehend them. And he ponders ways in which people and machines can work together to understand the present and respond to change. He sees human-machine collaborations as offering opportunities to accelerate individual and group adaptation. Of course, the challenge then is to facilitate that interaction, allowing both parties to rapidly learn. His work, his blog, his writing, it roams from data mining and machine learning to visualization and interaction design, all in the service of fostering the conversation. And he's one of the most interesting and intelligent guys that I have the pleasure to know. And so I'm just really thrilled to be speaking with you today, Chris. So welcome, and what's going on in your world?
Thanks so much, my friend. It is a true honor to sit down and have this conversation with you and just explore today. And I, as you know, I think over the last, certainly a little more than a year, I've certainly been going through some kind of major shifts and explorations here. Certainly kind of post 2016 election, which for all of us has been a kind of a focusing,
a learning experience.
Yeah, exactly. A huge shift. Funny enough, kind of rolling into 2017, certainly was reaching out to a lot of folks, friends, colleagues, asking them kind of how are they kind of showing up in light of all the things that we are now kind of just staring at, the things that have neglect and kind of downward spirals in this country that we are now seeing right in front of us, and thinking a lot about, how I personally want to show up.
Yeah. Well, and before we started recording, we were talking about, environmentalism and activism and your kind of work and interest in the nuclear space as well, and complexity. And I'm just curious, how does all of this tie together for you? You've got these wide-ranging interests, and they weave together. And I'm curious how you see that happening.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think, when I think about kind of the arc of my kind of professional life and some of the more recent changes and kind of shifts for me, if I rewind back and I think about, for my generation, kind of what we've lived through. I came out of my PhD program in December of 2000 and went to work at the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins University, which is a defense lab, broadly speaking. I think 7-8 months later, after I started there, 9/11 happened, which is obviously, for those of us that were, experienced that, we all remember exactly where we were that day and what unfolded. And, for me, I spent the next kind of 10 years in the national security community, kind of living through our response to that. And, it was kind of in processing a lot of that over time and seeing, in some sense, our response hasn't changed since those early years, right? We haven't thought as a nation deeply about those challenges. And, as I started to think, how do we become kind of more resilient to these new types of threats? My thinking started kind of, quote unquote, wandering, outside the box. And, I started thinking about what I was calling at the time local community resilience, and what does it mean to actually really work to nurture the social fabric of this nation. And
Yeah.
that is still quite a timely question to be asking, right?
Yeah.
And I realized that I really couldn't stay in that world anymore, because my questions were too cross-cutting. If you're somewhere kind of siloed in a particular area of government, I realized that, while I am fundamentally, I would call myself a technologist, that's kind of one hat that I wear. But I also describe myself as a skeptical technologist, right? That I realize that the deep challenges that we wrestle with, right, they're fundamentally human challenges, right? Like, questions about the human condition. And so I still feel like I'm on that journey. I mean, you and I, and that's what obviously so attracts me to your work and all of the intellectual kind of terrain that you're exploring. I mean, I just, you and I clearly figured out quite quickly that we're like in real synchrony there, right? And that, and I love that as you and I kind of, because of who we are and, where we've been, right? We kind of came into this terrain maybe from different directions, but a lot of the conclusions and the questions we're asking are so similar, right? Which is
absolutely
why I'm so glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that stood out to me most. I remember when you first reached out to me, I did a little digging into your website, and I loved the blogs are just really thought-provoking, but the thing that stood out to me most was, as you put it, like human-machine interactions, but for the sake not of like racing towards some singularity moment, which I feel like, when we think of technologists, that might be the thing that comes to mind, but it's human-machine interactions for the sake of human communities, for the sake of deep connection is another thing that we've been riffing on a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think this is particularly right as we're having this conversation and this whole Facebook, scandal is unfolding, and what we're learning about these platforms that, are basically where we are, are the product. Our data, is being collected at scale. I mean, this notion of surveillance capitalism and all the dangers that entails in terms of massive centralization of power and the potential for abuse of that power, and the attendant addiction and disconnection that results from that. And it's like, I personally have, very recently just pretty much cut my time on Facebook to near zero. And really, so as you and I have talked about before, it's like long walks in the morning, staring at the trees, listening to the birds. I mean, it sounds like so old school, but my God, do I feel more connected and grounded, and, my energy is shifted throughout the day. I mean, I'm in a much better headspace. And so it's, there's a part of me again that I'm so thankful for that technology. I mean, we can argue that that's precisely why you and I know one another.
That's
right?
how we, met.
Like, full stop, right? Like, that's amazing. We can build, amazing tribes, where now time and distance barriers are no longer a concern. But, there is a mindfulness, obviously, you and I talk about in terms of how we need to show up, right? And we're just still babes in the woods, right? Trying to figure out. It's not like, we want to, as you were saying, as I was listening to your recent podcast interview, where, it's like, no, we don't want to revert to like caveman times. It's not like trying to say, let's go back and just rewind the clock. It's, we know we're maladapted to the current environment we're in. So, let's not ignore the age-old wisdom that exists out there. There's a lot of things that we've forgotten. And I always say to people, technologists here, I mean, I'm presently sitting kind of in the heart of Silicon Valley here, and it always strikes me as fascinating where, as we're developing solutions, in the world of technology, everything's additive, right? It's like, well, once we just get to this point over the hill, everything's going to be great. When we reach the singularity and we have chance, it'll be amazing, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to saying, well, did we actually have the core ideas for thriving, X number of years in the past before all of this, right?
That's fascinating.
I think in many respects we do, right? It's
like,
why are we doing yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong? And, my former Tai Chi teacher would tell me all the time, if I'd come on talking about some study, she'd laugh at me. And so we've known about that forever.
It's like an old knowledge that, science and empiricism might be catching up with. And I see that so often in the somatic space too. It's like things somatic educators have known forever. It's like, neuroscience is finally catching up to validate that. And so now we can start to implement that within training or coaching environments. It's like, well, it's been there. It works.
Yeah. And the distinction I like to call out there, I've never written this down, but it's like the distinction I make is between what I could describe as the how and the why. So I think in the age-old wisdom, so if you take a practice like Tai Chi or Qigong, like that establishes the how, right? But what science is doing in many respects in this kind of catch-up mode, right, is coming along and explaining, well, in a new language, like what might be Qi or, these other manifestations, right? I mean, they were using the language that they had, right, to describe certain phenomena.
Sure.
And science may be able to come along and really dig into the why and just take that down to a level of resolution that we haven't seen before. But it doesn't mean that we don't know what to do. Like we just don't understand the mechanism necessarily. But that doesn't mean we don't have the answers.
Yeah.
And so it's this, a thought experiment I gave to some folks is I said, imagine that tomorrow we woke up and technology froze. There was not going to be like an iPhone 11, there isn't going to be the next version of Windows. Like what we have is all we've got, right?
Oh, so you're not saying like cataclysmic, like shutdown of technology, but technological progress stops.
It stops.
Gotcha.
Like imagine that thought experiment, right? Where now from tomorrow forward, you have to solve problems or challenges just with the tools that we have. Like no more forward progress, technologically speaking. What would you do, right? I think in that scenario, it gets very interesting and subtractive approaches where you say, I'm actually going to beat down complexity here. I'm going to kind of strip away the things that aren't really necessary. Like, I think we would shift our mindset.
I think you're right. Yeah. And so one of the things you touched on earlier was the need for interpersonal connection within communities. And I look at that from kind of the evolutionary lens as like, well, that's the meta brain that allows us to deal with a complex world that is levels of magnitude above what any individual can comprehend. I mean, we can't make sense of the world as individuals, and yet we seem to try to at this point. Like we've severed those ties to community or to tradition or ritual, and to the land as well, as we were talking about. And
and maybe to to dig into that a little bit more, I mean, one of the things I was really excited to hear more from you about is when you come at this from the deep ecology lens. You know, what are your thoughts about kind of helping folks reestablish that connection to the land, the environment, right? I mean, I think the thing that I struggle with is I don't know that we have kind of powerful enough ways in really to help folks reestablish that. You
That's
know, I mean,
interesting.
I guess the best I've heard is like, well, you know, you drink water and you eat the food and so forth. But as we were discussing prior to starting the recording, right, is this idea that, again, I don't really know where did my vegetables come from. I may, you know, in my case, I know where my kind of meat and my fish and so forth.
Yeah.
You know, generally speaking, I know where that comes from. But for many, that's not the case. For many, they're not even eating food. They're eating what I would describe as food products, right?
Oh, yeah.
Out of a box, right? I mean, it's not even, it's some sort of man-made creation, this Frankenfood. So I wanted to dig into that with you as well and just get your reaction to that.
Yeah. So it might be useful, because it's an odd sort of phrase that a lot of people don't know, but to maybe start with like what deep ecology is and layer on from there.
That's awesome.
So it's a bit of a philosophical way of being that I think was most clearly and originally, if I remember right, laid out by Arne Næss. He was a Norwegian philosopher. The Norwegian philosopher, like fan clubs in Norway kind of thing. And so he's looking at, you know, we've got ecology is looking at the relationships between things from a scientific lens. And so he's looking at this and saying, well, no, experientially, we have this deep, inextricable link to space and place. So it's not necessarily like, you know, flag waving rah environmentalism, but it's looking at our connection to the world as something fundamental about the human experience. And this is, I mean, the kind of guy who, when he was a teenager, climbed up these massive mountains in Norway and built a shelter up there. And he wanted to build a place where he could die, essentially, is what he was looking at, where he could live within the land and die within the land. So that body of work has kind of profoundly shifted my thinking, especially looking at what I see as maybe two of the fundamental like gaps that seem to be begging to be bridged: the kind of Cartesian body-mind split, and then the human nature dichotomy as well. And I see them almost as two facets of a broader schism. I mean, life is a mental process, it seems. And so it's like the boundaries get very blurry between what is mind, what is body, what is environment, especially when, I mean, on the level of the molecules we take in and assimilate into our structure. It's like we don't come into the world, like we emerge from the world and we go back to it. And in my experience, at least, movement practice was the avenue that got me into that greater sense of understanding, that greater felt connection. It's like you couldn't cognitively explain why you should fall in love with someone. It's an experience.
Yes.
Similarly, you can't come up with a cognitive case for connection and love of the land and of the earth around you. It has to be a felt thing. And, you know, something like a natural movement practice, or like you mentioned, just walking outside and being attuned to the sensory experience of what do you hear around you? What do you feel underfoot? What's it like to vault over that log or climb that tree or skip along rocks in a creek bed or just feel the grass under your feet, that starts to wake up something deep and primal and just foundational, it seems.
Yeah. And I think it's, it's within that perspective and then kind of broader global trends where I start to get probably a little more concerned, right? So it's, we live in a world now where basically everyone's moving to cities, and particularly cities on the coast. Right? So I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but it's in the not too distant future, right? More than, a majority of the world's population is going to be in cities on the coasts. So obviously, concerns of climate change, that's one particular threat that's going to continue to loom. But I also think about, what we're describing in terms of our well-being and our need to be connected to the land. And the fact that we already are in a situation where I think it was the WHO that said, depression is the number one cause of disability globally.
Yeah.
And why is that? Right? I mean, I know you and I share the belief that
have some thoughts.
Yeah, it has to do with this connection, right? So it's, and then I think that gets us into some really interesting territory about thinking about, design of our society, right? Like, how do we bring these principles in? Obviously here in the United States, the notion of the suburb is totally anathema to these principles, right? Where we don't have kind of shared public spaces anymore, where we can have those kind of random, unplanned collisions with other members of our community, self-sorting. We, as you were saying, we're in your recent interview, right? It's like we've become so fragile, and when I talk to folks about having political discussions or what have you, and when I meet anyone who's in my kind of liberal bubble who has a connection to someone of a conservative leaning, I always, and they talk about that discomfort, I always like, my God, I'm actually quite envious of you, right?
Yeah.
Because you have an opportunity here to really explore, what does it mean to be, to disagree without being disagreeable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And to really exercise that muscle, right? So, so there's, kind of just how are we moving forward and thinking about the future of our society, of place, like how we organize that.
There's something I want to circle back to, because I think you'll know a lot more about it than I will. But when you talk about designing communities, designing cities, I look at it from the lens of a top-down kind of design inherently doesn't seem to mesh with the complexity of the issues we're dealing with. And so I'm curious, like, where do you see, or how do you see, what could the design solutions look like for that? Or what are some of the possibilities there?
It's interesting. So, and I'm not sure I have a great answer, but it's, and I'm glad actually you called me on that, because I'm actually in firm agreement with you, right? So there's that design, that the use of that word does sound like it's kind of top down, centralized. And I think, frankly, that is the reality that we live in. I was just talking with a colleague recently about a lot of the kind of strategic planning that's happening in the city of San Jose, here in the South Bay, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And, they're thinking 20, 30 years out, right? And they're taking kind of their best guess at, various trends, and they've got some hypotheses. And I think that not that I'm some sort of, knowledgeable person about, kind of city planning, urban planning, but I think that is kind of the mindset that we have, right? When it comes to large infrastructure projects and investments and so forth. But I think what you're hinting at, right, is like that is fraught with danger, right? It's like you can make a big move, major investment, and that can be just a really bad idea that gets then instantiated in the physical realm. And then like how do you respond to that choice?
Yeah.
You might argue,
seems like the danger is both unknown and unknowable. Like it's an unpredictable danger, both in terms of the scale of it and the way it presents itself.
Honestly, if I were to go to look for insights, I think where I would look these days is actually in refugee cities. To call them camps, I don't think is actually the right,
not the most accurate.
I don't think it's the right choice, right? Because particularly with Syria imploding recently, and we're talking about millions of people that have migrated. And, these new, I don't even know what you want to call them, almost like, kind of, they're new cities, communities, what have you, refugee encampments. Again, I'm using that word because I'm struggling for a better word, but it's within the confines of those now kind of emergent and frankly permanent, kind of social systems, right? That a lot is I think quite emergent in those contexts, right? Because you don't have an overarching nation state necessarily that's driving kind of outcomes in that scenario. And in some of these cases, I mean, I haven't read the reporting carefully, but like there's a lot of innovation in some of these locations that's unfolding. So
by necessity, I would imagine you have to.
Exactly. Right. And so it's like, what does that look like? Right. What lessons could we learn from that?
Well, and that seems to be popping up in the movement space too, in terms like people are getting aware of systems as a way of examining how things work. Maybe as like an empirical way of understanding, like dynamical systems theory and all of this kind of stuff. And that idea around emergence, it's like that seems to be how life and processes grapple with complexity. It's not something you can predict, but it's, and I think the other thing, particularly as you bring up, emergent phenomena in different areas, it would depend on the context in which it emerges. Like the innovations within the Syrian refugee, we'll call them cities, would be drastically different than in Sudan, than in Uganda, than in anywhere. Like
totally.
And similarly within movement, it's like the constraints you place on that system would lead to entirely different organizational pathways. And it's fascinating to see that, just get a kind of a broader ripple of understanding.
Yeah. Well, I think this is, what's so fascinating about the kind of the terrain that we're exploring here, right? It's, whether we are talking about kind of phenomena at the level of the individual or rising all the way up to these, systems and large scale social systems and then going back to this kind of mind, body, and different ways of knowing, right? So our impulse to live in our heads and particularly given the amazing advances in science and technology, where we believe that we know more. I mean, the rate of knowledge production, right, is just like through the roof. But and none of us can actually even keep up with, all of those advances or put it into a broader context.
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, there's this, in my mind, this delusion of kind of understanding an illusion of control, right? There was like, particularly in technology, it's like, well, we'll just measure all the things, right? And we'll be able to predict everything, and then just create this control loop, and we'll just, we'll be able to sort this all out. I had a conversation, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, with somebody at the World Bank, and some folks that were in a new group where they were going to look at big data, in the context of international development. And I remember being on the call, and the individual that I was speaking with, was saying, well, these kind of social companies, like Facebook and Google and whatnot, they figured this out, we collect all this data and they can do amazing things. And we're going to bring that to international development. And, myself and some of my colleagues that were on the call, we, kind of had to just bite our tongue, because it's not the same. One of these things is not like the other, right?
Yeah.
In terms of actual complexity and really, frankly, what is knowable. And there's like a lack of understanding of how Mother Nature, through evolution, actually learns, right? This idea that it's, evolution in my mind is about having this kind of constant, constantly evolving and like dynamic pool of hypotheses, if you will, right? And natural selection is pulling, various ones out of the pool.
Yeah.
There's other mechanisms that are taking the surviving hypotheses and, intermingling those, right?
Yeah.
So there's crossbreeding and integration of those ideas. And as time evolves, right? It's like, riffing on, points that Taleb makes, right, about this notion of time is really your best test of the utility of an idea, right?
Yeah.
And
if it's old and still around, it's probably worth paying attention to.
Probably worth paying attention to, right? So it's, I still feel like, similar to, I think you and I feel like we're in similar places where we're putting a lot of these pieces of the puzzle down on the table. And I'll just speak for myself. I feel like I'm still trying to think about how to organize some of these ideas and into a broader context. And, I've certainly been thinking about for a long time, just like, how do we use technology to help ourselves understand our world in a better way, and actually work with others to make, positive change happen. And it was funny, actually, last night I was at a dinner with a gentleman here in the Bay Area who he spent the last 15 years of his life working on collaboration, and like what he does full time is just works with, various social, like whether it's nonprofits or, other groups that are really trying to advance positive change. And it was so funny because he and I both, we kind of stumbled on to the term wicked problem. And he and one of my friends who was there for the conversation, they started talking about an idea from this guy, Horst Ruttel, who coined this term back in the 70s. He was a design researcher at Berkeley, and he wrote this seminal paper basically outlining why kind of scientific approaches to social policy planning problems would just fail. And you go back and you read this paper, and it's just so timeless. And Ruttel was, back in the day, he was making fun of or criticizing AI researchers then, and saying, that's not what we need to do. We need to actually build technological tools that can help enhance our natural intelligence. Like he was already on that line, and way before the internet, and where he landed was, he said, you know what? Actually, going back to the term design, he said, design is argument, full stop. He said design is political. And where basically what his conclusion was is that he said we need to design what he described was issue-based information systems that allow groups of people to lay out complex arguments, and by extension, then reason about how they want to generate solutions to attack those very complex problems that they're kind of jointly thinking through. And, it's, still to this day, these lessons are I wouldn't say completely and widely understood. And even when they are, there's real questions about how to help facilitate those kinds of conversations. So when I was speaking with Eugene Kim, who I was talking to last night, and I was kind of looking for Eugene to kind of share with me his nuggets of wisdom from like hard-earned, experiences. And he said, he's like, yeah, I suck less at it, but like my batting average is better than when I started. But he's like, I tell you, man, it's every one of these engagements is different. You just, he's like, there are some kind of basics that you come back to. We were talking about just kind of relationships, and like there are certain engagements he just won't go into if he doesn't feel like that relational foundation is there to actually help facilitate the conversation. And one example that I thought he shared that was really beautiful was he worked on a water project where he got these people in the room that had been fighting with each other and suing each other for like, in some cases, decades. And these people like had never actually really had a conversation. And what he did is he put up a map and he asked everyone to highlight places on the map that are really special to them. Places that they love. And it was through that exercise and asking that question that got everybody grounded and opened the door to something, more substantive. And he also said, you don't presume anything. You don't go in there going, oh, we're going to solve the California water crisis. Of course not. You're not going to do that, right? That's not going to happen in a series of sessions. But can we build some relational capacity there that might be the gateway to something new? And so I want to toss this back to you. This is what I wanted to hear what you would riff on. Are you kind of riffing on that, where you would go with that notion of, given the things that you're exploring and whatnot, like, what do you think about how we might explore new pathways to developing relational capacity using movement and embodiment, right? Image, right? Maybe the right answer isn't to like lock a bunch of people up in a conference room, and ask certain questions. Maybe we need to kind of change our perspective and
so there are
more novel, right?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that came to mind as you were riffing on that. Harkening back to what we said, like if it's old and still around, like probably worth paying attention to. Totally. What I find so fascinating about all of the kind of reliance and like almost blind faith on technology is like we look at the history of science as we know it.
Yeah.
And like we could generously give it 600 years, give or take, compared to like the thousands and thousands and thousands of years in which human communities have solved problems. I
Yeah,
mean, perhaps
totally.
not at the scale of complexity that we're dealing with today, but
Yeah,
at some level of complexity. So
yeah,
there's that. Of course, again, not to over romanticize like going back to the past. I mean, we don't,
yeah,
it's nice that we have these,
yeah,
again, these human machine interactions that can facilitate solutions to human problems. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting about what you mentioned is, and I got to tie this in. I'm reading a book called Mind and Nature by Gregory Bateson. And it's a little outdated at this point. It's maybe written like 50 years ago. But he's looking at both evolution and learning as stochastic processes. And so, like you said, evolution throws in some ideas into the mix and some are taken out based on current context. Same with learning. It's like there are all sorts of options for solving this thing, and gradually you weed out the ones that don't work and you learn to walk or speak or communicate in a way that is most effective at solving that particular problem. So there's a parallel between
totally.
evolution and learning, both as some kind of broad mental process in terms of, and I use mental in this case kind of in line with like the Santiago theory of cognition, like mental relating to taking in sensory stimuli, processing that, and responding to those stimuli, which is it's how we exist in the world. Fundamentally, it's a mental process.
Totally.
So an idea I've been kicking around quite a bit is, and I think this maybe ties into this problem solving bit. So I've got this hunch that like relationship would be the fundamental unit of existence, not like a self and a self and a self and a self in an other. It's like relationship is the fundamental thing. And we could look at that as tied into like the Buddhist idea of codependent arising. It's like I exist in the world, and because of that, the world and I exist simultaneously. Suffice to say that relationship seems pretty damn important. Like that's got to be the oldest of old that is still around in some way. And so, holy shit, if there's something to pay attention to,
Yeah.
it's probably how we relate.
Yeah.
Relate to ourselves, relate to others, relate to the world around us.
Yeah.
And, you know, the guy who's been clicking with me the most is Carl Rogers. I stumbled onto his work last year, and founder of humanist psychology. And he's looking at what are the characteristics of a helping relationship So he's coming at it from the psychotherapeutic context. And so if you are a psychotherapist, what are the qualities that you can embody that will create the best context for growth? Not that you're going to fix a person or not that you're going to do this, but how can you create the conditions from which a more developed organism can emerge, from which a more whole organism can emerge? I mean, if you go into the psychotherapeutic relationship, we'll say in quotes, broken, fragmented, split in some way, how do you create conditions that allow a reunification of self? It's these three conditions that he found both subjectively from his own experience and objectively measuring psychotherapists from various different schools, which is interesting. First would be congruence. It's like, be what you are. So if you are frustrated, be frustrated. If you're like energized, be energized. Like if you're into it, be into it. As opposed to like the facade of, you could look at, say, like the psychoanalytic tradition where it's like you sit on the person's on the couch and you have this facade of I'm not going to respond, I'm not going to engage, even if internally I want to.
Yeah.
It's like congruence seems to be the intuitive, like I can smell whether you're being real with me or not, or I can sense based on your carriage, the way you organize yourself, whether you're in alignment between what you say and what you do and what you think.
Yeah.
So That would be the first. And then the second would be empathy. Like actually, and I think this ties into that map example you used of like actually trying to get a sense of what it's like to live life like this other person. Yeah. What are the things they hold dear? What are their like childhood like yearnings as they put these special places on the map? What do they hope for most in the world? And what are they afraid of? I tied into that. So that's a biggie as well. And then the third is unconditional positive regard. And it's like, if you could conceive of the best possible life for this person you're engaging with, or at least a life that would cause them the least amount of suffering, what does that look like? How do you genuinely wish the best for this person, regardless of whether that, gets you what you want or not? And he found that like those three things are almost the necessary and sufficient causes of growth. Or I don't want to say causes, but they're the necessary and sufficient conditions that facilitate growth and development of the human organism. And it's like, damn, you don't have to be a psychotherapist to put that into practice. I mean, when I got into his work, I mean, it's like the most recommended book on my list is On Becoming a Person, but it totally changed the way I approach coaching relationships. Changed the way I approach my friendships, my romantic relationship with Haley. It's like, it changed everything. And so we look at this from like a movement and embodiment perspective. And it's like, well, that first thing, congruence, it's like, you've got to have some awareness of what you're thinking and awareness of what you're feeling physiologically. Like, your emotional stuff will, again, emerge from physiological stuff. Like we know that from embodied cognition. So that's where I see movement and embodiment and awareness tying in. It's like, you've got to really figure yourself out in order to relate to someone else. And the oldest still around way of doing that is movement. That's how consciousness interfaces with the world. And it's like, God, we got to do something with that.
Well, and if I might layer in kind of what I feel is like a distinctly modern challenge, right? Is, if we rewind the clock and we go back, hundreds or thousands of years, way before we ended up in this kind of globalized society, kind of global system that we are a part of now, that technology has brought to bear, or has given life to, right?
Yeah.
If you think about, I don't know if you want to even think about it, it's like kind of the geographic extent of concern, of your community, right? That there's a kind of a bound on scale there, right? That you might argue that a lot of our kind of time-honored approaches, if you will, come from that context, and that this notion of living in a globalized world, right? This is something that is really a very modern manifestation, right? That we're still, wrestling with, and we will continue to wrestle with. And the thing that, we were starting to touch on right before we started recording, right, was the implications of that. Where now, if we are, believing that, fundamentally, that's like we need to be obviously connected to ourselves, connected to those around us, connected to the land. How is globalization pulling us away from that? And what, if anything, do we need to do to reclaim connection? Right? Is that trend line kind of racing in the wrong direction and accelerating? Again, if there are systems that I am part of or that I interact with that frankly I just don't understand, and very few people understand, and you might argue and go even a step further. It's like, how well can we even fundamentally understand these systems? So it's, I would argue we live in a world where surprise is now the norm, and that the rate of surprise and the magnitude of the implications of those surprises, they're both increasing. Mm-hmm. And that brings fragility into our world that is creates a whole host of problems, right? So and again, this, kind of is my national security mindset kind of coming through, which is really, frankly, is a systems mindset, right? And it's, I would always chuckle in that world where the impulse from a technological point of view, and that impulse is still very strong, which is to say, oh, well, if we just build better data collection and, leverage more sophisticated computational techniques, we'll figure this out, right? We'll be able to construct the bigger picture. We'll be, whether it's, oh, we want to predict the future of this political system in this country or what have you, and I laugh every time, right? Because it's like, you all don't understand kind of where that horizon is, right? There are things that are just fundamentally unknowable. We will not be able to predict them and therefore control them. Mm-hmm. That's the wrong mindset.
Yeah.
The name of the game is always about adaptation, and it's even more so in those kinds of environments. So why do I raise all that? Well, if you step back and, as you alluded to, my interest more recently in the threat of nuclear weapons, or, an analogous existential threat of climate change, right? These are truly global problems. And one might argue that local action in your community against those problems in and of itself is necessary, but not sufficient to actually, completely move the needle. And so that raises some interesting questions for us, right? In terms of saying, if I now have to synchronize in some manner my actions with others at a distance in communities that may be all over this country or all over this planet, how do we do that, right? What does that look like? Do we have the mechanisms for that? What we certainly see with social media is we see the ability to activate networks, right? And get like bodies on streets, or what have you, whether it's like, the Arab Spring or any other examples like that, or more recently after the most recent, tragedy, gun tragedy in Florida. And now, students are taking the streets by storm across this country to demand action. There's an ability to rapidly activate, but a lot of folks say, well, even some of the key people in the Arab Spring, particularly the movement in Egypt, where they said, yeah, we were very good at kind of mobilizing folks, getting bodies on the streets, but we were bad at actually doing the hard work of building relational capacity. And so I think that's the thing I'm wrestling with, right? It's like because of the nature, technology has created this scale. We built these systems that truly are global in nature, which creates, by extension, global challenges that span time and distance. But that also, if I keep drawing that out, I think that also basically demands new approaches that allow folks to engage at a much larger scale, to shift the direction of those present realities in terms of how things are unfolding. And, I don't claim to have any answers there, but it's, I'm kind of coming back to fundamentals, which is, what might it look like to build a storytelling platform, right? That is situated in the context of movement building, right? That has political aims, right? Mm-hmm. So if I take the example of nuclear weapons, the question I'm sitting with and trying to get close to, right, is, well, what is the lived experience of communities that are basically on the fence lines of facilities that are part of the nuclear weapons complex, right? They have a lived experience that, most tragically and most often is one of, just environmental, tragedies that resulted from, all sorts of poor decisions and people dumping things into the ground and just being kind of careless with how they're handling very obviously highly radioactive material and so forth that can damage an ecosystem for essentially time immemorial, right? So these communities, they certainly have shared values, they have shared experience. Developing those ties at a distance is a challenge. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the most reasonable thing would be to think, local problems require local solutions. Like we've seen that play out in any number of scenarios, and yet a global problem does by necessity require a global solution. So you got to wonder, how do you find, what's the fundamental ground on which we all stand? And, I would say literally it's like the ground, which maybe ties us back to that idea of deep ecology. And, that seems to be one of the fundamental problems. And it's something I wrestle with. And again, I don't know that there's a good solution, but it's like, how do we give people even access to the opportunity to have that felt, visceral, real experience of connection? Because, it's nice for us to talk about connection when we live in we'll paint in broad strokes. You and I are living pretty decent,
totally. That's right.
We'll say privileged lives. And it's
that's right.
There are people who may not even have access to a connection like that, to anything that we could call nature, to anything that we could call a movement practice, all of this stuff. It's boggling.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you raised that notion of the idea of privilege here, because it's last year, so I was invited by my friend, a friend of mine in the Navajo Nation, to come out and give a talk there. Mm. And it was so interesting to think about, well, first and foremost, what do I even share that's of value, right? What can I say that's helpful? How can I show up as an outsider? And I was really sensitive to the idea of, and I wanted to go in with an awareness of, their exposure to the issue of nuclear weapons, which for them is really through the lens of uranium mining, where there's over 1,000 abandoned uranium mines in Navajo land, and it's only now many decades later, literally as we speak, where the EPA is engaging and doing the preliminary work to start this program where $1 billion will be spent to basically remediate mines all over the Navajo Nation. Mm-hmm. It's just a very, very tragic story. And showing up in that context, checking your privilege, realizing as I was feeling a lot of discomfort going into that, a friend of mine actually said to me, "It sounds like you want somebody to actually kind of relieve you of that discomfort prior to you going out there." And actually that actually set off a really interesting thought in my own mind, which is, oh, I hadn't actually thought about the idea of privilege as the ability to choose when you're uncomfortable and not have them imposed on you.
That's really interesting.
Isn't that interesting? That kind of popped into my head one day while walking, and I thought, oh my goodness, again, it's a reminder of how privileged I am, right? There's so many people in this world who don't have that choice.
Yeah.
Right? It's being imposed on them day and day, day after day.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that are outside of their control, and they just have to deal. But we folks like you and I we are choosing to find those edges and to lean into and explore uncomfortable dimensions, because we know that's where the growth is. But we get to choose
That's
really
profound.
When that happens, right? We get to choose that.
Well, and that's, that makes me think just the whole kind of existential demand that we have, where it's like, if you get to choose, you have a duty to choose. You have a responsibility tied in with the right, because if you don't, then you're squandering something that you cannot fully comprehend. And it's like, I'm thinking to some of Jordan Peterson's work as well. I dig quite a bit of what he says, and it's like things fall apart on their own. But that's the default, is things falling apart. And it takes care and consideration and sacrifice from those who are able to make that choice in order to make things, if not better, to keep them from falling apart.
And I love that. And to riff on that for a moment, and really echoing your words that I know I've heard you say in different ways, right? It's like, it almost feels like we're living in a time where, because of our technology and the way we are organized, in some sense, we're thwarting that, right? We're constructing environments where, again, we're comfortable the vast majority of the time. We have the ability to control and to shield ourselves. And, we know, you and I think fully believe in doing so, you are limiting your growth.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe actually even fostering regression.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're, you and I both are sitting with some really big questions, and maybe even, if I speak for myself, it's just getting clarity on the questions themselves. And for me, the stepping into this world of nuclear weapons, right? The issue in some sense is kind of immaterial, in terms of, like, I probably could have gone down other roads, and it just happened that particular doors opened for me where that was available, and I chose to walk through them and continue to feel the pull and to walk down that path. But the gifts that I think exploring that kind of challenge are more universal, right? I mean, the opportunity to deal with something so profoundly complex that, it's unlike anything else I've ever tried to make a contribution, or like towards, or, make a difference, right? Where in the earliest days, I was like, and now in retrospect, I can see how I was trying to kind of quickly grab the brass ring and like make an impact, right? Gotta get the gold star, right? And when all of that didn't work, or it was like, wow, this is way more difficult than I thought, or it's, that my colleagues who were encouraging me to show up as a technologist, when I realized that's not what's needed here fundamentally. I mean, there are pieces of the problem where, thank goodness, we have certain experts that are engaging, but the deeper resolution is it's about dealing with fundamental human challenges, right? Like fear and mistrust and getting the United States and now Russia to move past this animosity that due to poor choices. I mean, poor choices on our side with the United States, where we came out of the Cold War as victors, but we've made choices to make them feel threatened and vulnerable, and we need to own that and ask ourselves, do we just want to keep playing this game time immemorial, or do we want to get off this road? Do we want to go in a different direction?
There's a lot to unpack there.
And
but I do want to be cognizant that it's dinner time for you and nearing bedtime for me, in fact. Flux reminds me I'm waking up in single digit hours.
This has been amazing. I think
it's been good.
We covered some really interesting ground here. So I'm definitely looking forward to more.
Absolutely. Likewise.
Thanks, man.
Well, man, thank you.